My name is Samuel Johnson. I am 76 years old and I live in Cincinnati, Ohio. I have lived a long, difficult life, and today, as I sit on this old wooden bench in a small park near my apartment, watching the leaves fall from the trees, I want to share my story. Not because I expect pity, but because life has taught me lessons. Some harsh, some beautiful, and I believe stories like mine should be told. I was born in 1948 in a small house on the outskirts of Memphis, Tennessee. My parents, Robert and Mary Johnson, were poor, hard-working people. My father worked in a steel factory, and my mother took care of the house and did laundry for the richer families in town. We didn't have much. Our house was barely standing, and some nights we went to bed hungry. But my parents never let us feel like we were poor. They taught us to be grateful for what we had. I was the eldest of 5 siblings. Life was not easy for us, but we had each other. I grew up watching my father come home exhausted, his hands covered in grease, his back aching from long hours of labor. I saw my mother silently crying at night when she thought no one was watching because she didn't know how she would feed us the next day. But they never gave up, and they taught me the value of hard work. As a child, I never dreamed of wealth or success. I just wanted to make life a little easier for my family. But life, as I would come to understand, does not always go the way we want it to. When I turned 16, I dropped out of high school to work. My father had gotten sick, his lungs weakened from years of working in the factory. He could barely stand some days, and we needed money. I took a job at a gas station, cleaning floors, pumping gas, and doing whatever was needed. It wasn't much, but it kept food on the table. At 18, I decided to leave Memphis. There were no opportunities there, only more suffering. I packed a small bag, said goodbye to my family, and took a bus to Detroit, Michigan, where I had heard there were jobs in the automobile industry. I promised my mother I would send money home every month, and I did, at least for as long as I could. I found work at a car factory, assembling parts on the production line. It was back-breaking work, but it paid better than the gas station. I rented a small room in a boarding house, shared with 3 other men who were also trying to escape poverty. We barely spoke. We were all too tired from working 12-hour shifts. For a while, things got better. I sent money home, and my siblings were able to stay in school. But then the factory laid off hundreds of workers, including me. I was 22 years old, broke and jobless in a city where no one cared if I lived or died. I spent nights sleeping in shelters, sometimes on park benches. The little money I had ran out quickly. I remember one night sitting under a bridge, shivering in the cold, my stomach aching from hunger. I had never felt more hopeless in my life. But I wasn't ready to give up. I took whatever job I could find, washing dishes, sweeping floors, unloading trucks. Every penny mattered. I moved to Chicago, hoping for better opportunities. There I met Margaret, the woman who would become my wife. She worked as a waitress in a small diner where I often ate when I could afford a meal. She had a warm smile, and even though she didn't have much, she was always kind to me. We fell in love, and within a year we got married. We moved into a tiny apartment in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where I found work in construction. It was tough, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had a real future. We had our first and only child, David, when I was 30. He was the light of my life. I wanted him to have everything I never did. I worked harder than ever, taking extra shifts, saving every dollar I could. But then tragedy struck. Margaret fell ill. It started with small things: fatigue, weakness, dizziness. Then the doctors told us it was cancer. We had no insurance. The medical bills were more than we could ever afford. I sold everything we had, took on more jobs, borrowed money from anyone who would lend it. But it wasn't enough. She passed away when David was only 6 years old. I had lost the love of my life. I had lost everything, but I couldn't fall apart. I had a son to raise. I did my best, but life was unkind. Without Margaret, I struggled. I worked day and night, barely sleeping, just to make sure David had food and clothes. But no matter how hard I tried, it was never enough. As David grew older, I could see resentment in his eyes. He saw other kids with new shoes, toys, and nice houses while we lived in a rundown apartment. He hated being poor. When he turned 18, he left. He said he wanted to make something of himself, that he didn't want to struggle like I did. I understood. I let him go. I stayed in Milwaukee, working whatever jobs I could. The years passed quickly. I grew older, my body weaker. Construction work became impossible, so I took janitorial jobs, then security guard shifts. But eventually no one wanted to hire an old man. By the time I turned 70, I had nothing left. No job, no savings, no home. I ended up in a tiny one-room apartment in Cincinnati, living off Social Security checks that barely covered rent and food. I spent my days sitting in the park, watching the world move on without me. One day, after years of silence, I got a letter from David. He was living in New York, working as a lawyer. He had a family, a wife and 2 children I had never met. He said he was sorry for leaving, that he had been angry and young. He asked if I wanted to come live with him. I thought about it for a long time, but in the end I said no. Not because I didn't love him, but because I wanted him to remember me as the father who fought for him, not the old man who had nothing left. As I sit on this old wooden bench in the park, the cool autumn breeze brushing against my wrinkled skin, I close my eyes and let my memories carry me away. Life has been long, filled with struggles, pain, and loss, but also moments of love, resilience, and hope. I often wonder if I made the right decision by staying here in Cincinnati instead of moving to New York with David. A part of me longs to see him, to meet my grandchildren, to sit at a dinner table surrounded by family, to feel like I belong somewhere again. But another part of me knows that time has changed too much. I don't want to be a burden. I live a simple life now. My tiny one-room apartment is not much, but it's enough. I wake up early every morning, make myself a cup of coffee, and sit by the window watching the world outside. Sometimes I walk to the local grocery store and chat with the cashier, Mrs. Thompson, a kind woman in her 50s who always asks how I'm doing. "You should get a dog, Mr. Johnson," she tells me often. "It'll keep you company." I smile at her suggestion, but I know I can barely afford to feed myself, let alone a pet. My days are slow. I take long walks in the park, watching young families with their children, elderly couples holding hands, and groups of teenagers laughing and living without a care in the world. Sometimes I see homeless people sitting on the sidewalks, and I remember the nights I spent sleeping under bridges, cold and hungry, wondering if I would make it through the next day. There's a small diner not far from my apartment, Eddie's Diner, where I sometimes sit for hours with a single cup of coffee. The owner, Eddie, is a man in his 60s with a warm heart. He knows I don't have much money, so sometimes he brings me a slice of pie without charging me. "On the house, Sam," he says with a wink. "You remind me of my old man." Eddie's kindness is one of the few things that still makes me feel human in a world that often forgets people like me. But loneliness is a heavy thing. At night, when I lie on my small bed, the silence of my apartment feels deafening. There was a time when my life was full of noise. Margaret's laughter, David's playful shouts, the sound of my co-workers at the construction site. Now all I have is the ticking of the old clock on my wall. I think about Margaret often. It's been decades since she passed, but some nights I still feel her presence beside me. I wonder if she would be proud of the man I became, or if she would be disappointed that I never managed to pull myself out of poverty. And then there's David, my son. I wish I had been able to give him more. I wish he had grown up in a house filled with warmth and security instead of watching me struggle to keep food on the table. But I did my best, and in the end, he made something of himself. That should be enough. One afternoon, as I'm sitting on my bench in the park, watching the pigeons peck at the ground, I hear a voice behind me. "Excuse me, sir." I turn around and see a young man, probably in his late 20s, with a notebook and a camera in his hands. He has a friendly smile and kind eyes. "My name is Ethan Parker. I'm a journalist. I'm working on a piece about the untold stories of the elderly in Cincinnati. Would you mind sharing your story with me?" I hesitate. No one has ever asked to hear my story before. Most people pass by without a second glance, as if I'm invisible. But something about this young man makes me trust him. I nod. "All right, son, what do you want to know?" He sits beside me, flips open his notebook, and clicks his pen. "Tell me everything." So I do. I tell him about my childhood in Memphis, my father's long hours in the factory, my mother's silent struggles. I tell him about leaving home at 18, working in Detroit, getting laid off, sleeping on the streets. I tell him about moving to Chicago, meeting Margaret, falling in love, having David and losing her too soon. As I talk, memories flood back, some painful, some beautiful. I see Ethan's eyes glisten as he listens, genuinely moved by my words. "Mr. Johnson," he says after I finish, "your story is incredible. Would you be okay if I published it?" I pause. My story? In a newspaper? It feels strange, but at the same time it feels good. Maybe, in some small way, my life will mean something to someone. Maybe someone, somewhere, will read it and understand that even in struggle, there is strength. "All right," I say with a small smile. "Go ahead, son." A few weeks later, Ethan finds me again. He hands me a newspaper, and there, on the front page of the local section, is my picture with the headline, "A Life of Resilience, the Story of Samuel Johnson." I read every word, and for the first time in years, I feel seen. A few days later, something unexpected happens. I receive a letter. It's from David. He read the article. "Dad," he writes, "I had no idea you were going through this. I should have checked in sooner. I want you to come live with us. Please." Tears blur my vision as I fold the letter. For the first time in a long time, I feel hope. Maybe, after all these years, I don't have to be alone anymore. Maybe it's time to go home. The letter from David sat in my hands, trembling slightly as I read his words over and over again. It felt unreal, like a dream I didn't dare believe. He wanted me to come live with him. For years, I had convinced myself that I was forgotten. that David had moved on with his life without looking back. And maybe that was partially my fault. I had let the distance grow, too ashamed of my own struggles to reach out. But now, here it was, an invitation, a chance to be part of his life again. I carefully folded the letter and placed it inside the old leather wallet I had carried for decades. My fingers traced the worn edges, the same wallet that had once held pictures of Margaret and David when he was just a boy. It held memories, reminders of a life that once was. But could I really go? As much as I wanted to see my son again, doubts gnawed at me. What if I was a burden? What if his wife and children didn't want an old man in their home? I had spent so long being independent, surviving on my own, that the thought of relying on someone else, even my own son, felt foreign. That night I lay in my small bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, unable to sleep. The city outside was quiet, the occasional sound of a car passing by breaking the silence. My mind kept returning to David's letter, and then I made my decision. The next morning I gathered what little I had: an old duffel bag, a few clothes, my wallet, and a small box of keepsakes. Letters from Margaret, David's childhood drawings, a few faded photographs. I didn't have much, but these things were my life. I took one last look at my tiny apartment. The peeling paint, the dim light bulb hanging from the ceiling, the rickety table where I had eaten countless lonely meals. This place had been my home for years, but it had never really felt like one. I locked the door behind me and stepped outside, feeling the crisp morning air on my face. I made my way to the bus station, where I bought a one-way ticket to Boston, Massachusetts, where David lived. The old man at the ticket counter glanced at me, then at my duffel bag, and gave me a kind smile. "Going to see family?" he asked. I hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, my son." "Good for you," he said. "Family's important." I took my seat on the bus, watching as the city of Cincinnati faded into the distance. The journey was long, nearly 15 hours, but I barely noticed. My mind was too busy racing with thoughts of what awaited me at the end of the road. Would David be waiting for me at the station? What would I say to him after so many years? What would his children think of me, a grandfather they had never met? The bus finally pulled into Boston's South Station, and as I stepped off, my heart pounded in my chest. I scanned the crowd, my hands gripping the strap of my bag tightly. And then I saw him. David. He was standing near the entrance, his tall frame familiar even after all these years. His hair was slightly graying at the temples, but his face was unmistakably the boy I had raised. And beside him was a woman, his wife, I assumed, and two young children. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he took a step forward. "Dad?" His voice was softer than I remembered. I swallowed the lump in my throat and nodded. "Yes, son, it's me." And just like that, he hugged me, tightly. It was the first real hug I had felt in decades. "I'm sorry, Dad," he whispered. "I should have found you sooner." I shook my head, trying to keep my emotions in check. "No, son, I should have reached out. But I'm here now." We pulled apart, and his wife, Emily, stepped forward, offering a warm smile. "It's so nice to finally meet you, Mr. Johnson." I smiled nervously. "Just call me Sam." Then I looked down at the two children, a boy and a girl, maybe 8 and 10 years old. They watched me curiously, and I suddenly felt unsure. David placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "This is Jacob, and this is Lily. Kids, this is your grandfather. Grandfather. The word felt strange, foreign, and yet right. Jacob hesitated, then gave me a small wave. Hi, Grandpa. Lily grinned. Do you like cookies? Mom made some for you. I chuckled, feeling a warmth I hadn't known in years. I love cookies. We left the station together, David carrying my duffel bag, Emily chatting with me about the house they lived in, and the kids excitedly talking about their favorite games. For the first time in so many years, I wasn't alone. Their house was beautiful, a warm, welcoming home in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Newton, just outside Boston. It was nothing like the places I had lived in for most of my life. Inside, the smell of fresh-baked cookies filled the air, family photos lined the walls, and there was a cozy fireplace in the living room. It felt like home. That night, as I lay in the guest room, a real bed, in a real home, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Belonging. I wasn't just an old man in a forgotten city anymore. I was Sam Johnson, a father, a grandfather, a man who had lived a hard life but had finally found his way back to where he belonged. And for the first time in a long time, I closed my eyes and slept peacefully, knowing that I was no longer alone. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee brewing and the sound of laughter coming from the kitchen. It took me a moment to remember where I was, to shake off the years of waking up alone in a cold, empty apartment. But then I heard it again. Lily's giggle, followed by Jacob's excited chatter. I sat up, running a hand through my thinning hair, and took a deep breath. This was real. When I stepped out of the guest room, I found David sitting at the kitchen table, a newspaper in front of him and a steaming mug of coffee in his hands. He looked up and smiled. "Morning, Dad," he said. "Hope you slept well." I nodded, still adjusting to this new reality. Better than I have in years. Emily was at the stove, flipping pancakes. When she saw me, she smiled warmly. "Good morning, Sam. Hope you're hungry." The kids insisted we make a big breakfast for Grandpa. Before I could respond, Jacob ran up to me, his eyes bright with excitement. "Do you like pancakes, Grandpa?" I chuckled, feeling a warmth I hadn't felt in years. "I love pancakes, kiddo." Lily grabbed my hand and pulled me to the table. "Then you have to sit next to me." I let myself be led, sitting down as Emily placed a plate in front of me. It had been years since I had sat at a family breakfast table like this, since Margaret used to wake me and David up early on Sunday mornings to make pancakes together. I glanced over at David, who was watching me closely, as if he was trying to gauge how I was feeling. He knew. He knew that this was all new to me, that I had been alone for so long. "How's your coffee, Dad?" he asked. I took a sip. It was strong, just how I liked it. I nodded. "It's perfect." For the next hour we ate, talked, and laughed. The kids told me all about their school, their favorite cartoons, and even asked if I knew how to play video games. I didn't, but that didn't seem to bother them. "You can learn," Jacob said confidently. Dad didn't know how to play at first either. David laughed. "That's true, but they taught me." After breakfast, Emily had to take the kids to school, and David had to go to work. He worked as an engineer for a big company in downtown Boston. Before leaving, he patted my shoulder. "Make yourself at home, Dad. We'll be back later, but if you need anything, Emily left some snacks in the fridge." I nodded, still trying to understand this new life I had suddenly stepped into. "Thanks, son." When they all left, the house fell into silence. but it wasn't the kind of silence I was used to. It wasn't lonely. I spent the day slowly walking around the house, looking at the pictures on the walls. There were wedding photos of David and Emily, baby pictures of Jacob and Lily, family vacations, birthdays, so many moments I had missed. And for the first time, it hit me. I had lost so much time, but I was here now. And maybe, just maybe, I still had a chance to be part of this family. Days turned into weeks, and slowly I began to settle into this new life. At first it was strange. I had spent so many years living for myself, worrying only about where my next meal would come from, that it felt odd to have people care for me, to have a home again. But David and his family never made me feel like a burden. Lily and Jacob loved spending time with me. Every evening after dinner, they would sit with me in the living room, asking me to tell them stories. "Tell us about when Dad was a kid," Lily would say, eyes bright with curiosity. I would laugh and share stories from David's childhood, how he used to be afraid of the dark, how he once tried to keep a stray dog in his room without Margaret knowing, how he had always dreamed of becoming an astronaut when he was young. David would groan and shake his head. "Dad, you're making me sound embarrassing." But I could see the smile tugging at his lips. Emily, too, was incredibly kind. She never treated me like an outsider. She made sure I was comfortable, always asking if I needed anything. She reminded me so much of Margaret, kind, patient, always thinking of others. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, David and I sat on the back porch. It was quiet, the cool night air wrapping around us. "Dad," he said after a long silence, "I wanted to ask you something." I looked at him. "What is it, son?" He hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "Would you ever consider staying here? Permanently?" I felt my breath catch in my throat. David glanced at me. "You don't have to decide now, but I don't want you going back to Cincinnati. You don't have anyone there, and we want you here. The kids love having you around. I love having you around." I stared out into the yard, my mind racing. For so long I had convinced myself that I was alone, that I had to survive on my own. But maybe I didn't have to anymore. I looked back at my son, the boy I had raised, the boy I had once held in my arms, the boy who had grown into a good, kind man. I thought about the empty apartment in Cincinnati, the cold winters, the loneliness. Then I thought about the warmth of this house, the laughter of my grandchildren, the kindness of Emily, the way David looked at me, not out of pity, but out of love. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe that I still belonged somewhere. I let out a breath and nodded. "I think I'd like that." David's face lit up, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something deep in my heart. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was living again. The days passed, turning into weeks, and soon the idea of leaving Boston never even crossed my mind. At first, I told myself it was just temporary, that I'd stay for a little while, help out around the house, spend time with the kids, and then return to my old apartment in Cincinnati. But the truth was, I had nothing to go back to. Here, in this house, I had warmth, I had laughter, I had family. Jacob and Lily had practically attached themselves to me. Every afternoon they'd come running home from school, excited to tell me about their day. "Grandpa, we had a spelling test today," Jacob announced one afternoon, dropping his backpack in the hallway. "And I got a gold star in art class," Lily added, holding up a drawing of what I assumed was a cat. though it had 3 tails and wings. "That's amazing, both of you," I said, pulling them into a hug. "Do you think I can be an artist when I grow up?" Lily asked, looking up at me with wide eyes. I smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Sweetheart, you can be anything you want to be." Jacob tugged on my sleeve. "And what about me? What do you think I'll be?" I pretended to think. A scientist, a teacher, maybe even an astronaut." His face lit up. "An astronaut? That's the coolest one." David, who had been standing in the doorway, smiled. "Well, let's start with finishing your homework first, buddy." Jacob groaned but obeyed, and as he walked off, David looked at me. "They love you, Dad." I felt my heart swell. I love them too. He sat down next to me on the couch, rubbing his hands together. "Listen, I know you haven't officially decided, but—" He hesitated. "Emily and I have been talking, and we want you to stay. Permanently." I looked at him, surprised. David continued, "You don't need to worry about anything, Dad. We've got a guest room, we've got space. And honestly, I don't want you to be alone anymore." For a long time, I had believed that being alone was just my reality, that it was something I had to accept. But what if it didn't have to be that way? I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Are you sure? I don't want to be a burden." David frowned. "You're not a burden. You're my father." There was something in his voice, something firm, something that told me he truly meant it. And in that moment, I knew. I wasn't going back to Cincinnati. I wasn't going back to that empty apartment, those lonely nights, those days spent in silence. I was home. The next few months were some of the best of my life. I found a rhythm in my days. In the mornings, I would help Emily get the kids ready for school. I'd pack their lunches, tie their shoes, and remind them not to forget their jackets. In the afternoons, I'd take walks around the neighborhood, sometimes stopping at the coffee shop down the street where I got to know the locals. They were kind, friendly people, people who actually wanted to talk to me. In the evenings, I'd help Emily with dinner while David finished up work. Then we'd all sit around the table, talking about our day, laughing, sharing stories. It was so simple, so ordinary. But to me, it was everything. One evening, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat on the back porch with a cup of tea, staring up at the stars. I thought about Margaret. I thought about how she would have loved this, how she would have adored Emily and the kids, how proud she would have been of David. I closed my eyes, feeling the cool night breeze against my face. "I made it, sweetheart," I whispered. "I finally made it home." For the first time in years, I felt at peace, not just surviving, not just getting by, but truly living. The months turned into a year, and before I knew it, my life in Boston felt like it had always been this way. Gone were the days of waking up to silence, of eating alone, of wondering if I had anything left to live for. Instead, my mornings were filled with the sound of little feet running through the house, of coffee brewing in the kitchen, of Emily humming softly as she packed lunches for Jacob and Lily. I had purpose again. I helped around the house however I could, fixing things, organizing the garage, even tending to a small garden in the backyard. Emily said it was nice having an extra set of hands, but I knew she was just being kind. Still, I appreciated it. For the first time in years, I felt useful. David and I grew closer too. Our conversations became longer, deeper. He asked me about my past, about my struggles after Margaret passed, about why I had never reached out sooner. One night we were sitting on the porch, just the two of us, sharing a bottle of beer. "Dad," David said, swirling the liquid in his bottle, "why did you never call? After Mom died, after I moved away, why didn't you tell me how bad things got?" I stared at my hands, the wrinkles deep, the skin weathered from years of working, from years of surviving. "I guess. I thought you had your own life to live," I admitted. "You had a family, a career. I didn't want to be a burden." David exhaled, shaking his head. "Dad, you are my family. You always have been." There was pain in his voice, and it hit me then. How much my absence had hurt him. How much he had wanted me in his life, even when I convinced myself he was better off without me. "I'm sorry, son," I said quietly. David looked at me, his eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in years. Understanding. "I just wish I had known sooner," he said. "But you're here now, and that's what matters." I nodded, feeling a lump rise in my throat. Yes, I was here now. As time passed, I settled into my new life completely. I became a part of the kids' daily routine, picking them up from school, helping with homework, telling bedtime stories. Jacob loved hearing about the old days, as he called them. "Tell me about when you were a kid, Grandpa," he would say, his eyes wide with curiosity. So I told him. I told him about growing up in Cleveland, Ohio, about playing baseball in the streets with my friends, about how we used to buy candy for just a few cents. I told him about the first time I saw Margaret, about how nervous I was when I asked her out. Lily would giggle. "Did she say yes right away?" I chuckled. "Not exactly. She made me wait 3 weeks before she finally agreed to go to the movies with me." "Sounds like Mom," Jacob muttered, and we all laughed. Life was good, better than I had ever imagined it could be. But then, one morning, everything changed. I had been feeling off for a few weeks, tired more often, a dull pain in my chest that came and went. I brushed it off, convincing myself it was nothing. But that morning, as I was helping Emily clear the breakfast table, a sharp pain shot through my chest, so sudden and intense that it stole the breath from my lungs. I gripped the counter, my vision blurring. "Sam," Emily's voice was distant, concerned. "Are you okay?" I wanted to answer, but the pain grew worse. A crushing pressure, as if an invisible hand was squeezing my heart. I heard Emily shout my name just before everything went black. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed, the steady beep, beep, beep of a heart monitor filling the room. David was sitting beside me, his eyes red-rimmed, his face pale. "Dad," he breathed when he saw me wake up. "Jesus, you scared the hell out of us." I blinked, trying to gather my thoughts. "What happened?" David swallowed hard. "You had a heart attack." The words sank in slowly, like stones dropping into a deep well. A heart attack. I stared at him. "Am I?" "You're stable now," he reassured me. "The doctors said it was mild, but Dad, you can't ignore this. You need to take better care of yourself." I looked at him, really looked at him, the worry in his eyes, the way his hands clenched together as if he was holding himself together. I had spent so many years surviving, but I had never truly cared for myself, and now it had caught up to me. I spent a week in the hospital, and during that time something shifted. David visited me every day, sometimes with Emily, sometimes with the kids. Jacob and Lily made me get well cards, their little hands drawing stick figures of me in the backyard, smiling. When the doctor finally said I could go home, David insisted on one thing: no more skipping doctor's appointments, No more pretending you're fine when you're not. I nodded. Okay. And for the first time, I meant it. Because I had something worth living for. I recovered slowly, and life returned to normal. But something in me had changed. I no longer saw each day as something to get through. I saw it as a gift. I spent more time with Jacob and Lily, teaching them how to fish, taking them to the park. I shared old stories with David, talking about Margaret, about the things I had never told him before. I started taking better care of myself, eating healthier, going on gentle walks, making sure I didn't push myself too hard, and through it all I realized something. For years I had been lost, wandering through life, convinced that I was meant to be alone. But I wasn't. I had found my way home, not just to a house, but to love, to family, to life. And as I sat in the backyard one evening, watching Jacob and Lily chase fireflies, I realized I had never truly been alone. I just had to open my heart to see it. One evening, as I sat on the porch with a warm cup of tea, I watched the sun slowly dip below the horizon. The sky was painted in soft shades of orange and purple, and a cool breeze rustled through the trees. It was peaceful. David sat beside me, sipping his own cup of coffee. He had gotten into the habit of sitting with me in the evenings, just the two of us, talking about anything and everything. "Dad," he said, his voice thoughtful, "do you ever think about Cincinnati?" I smiled softly, shaking my head. "No, son, I don't." He raised an eyebrow. "Not even a little." I looked at him and said, "Because I finally found where I belong." For years, I thought happiness was behind me, that I had lost everything that made life worth living. But I was wrong. Love doesn't end. It shifts, it changes, it takes new forms. And if you're lucky enough, you'll find it again. I found it in my son's voice, in my daughter-in-law's kindness, in the laughter of my grandchildren. I found it in the little things, the smell of fresh coffee in the morning, the warmth of a family dinner, the simple joy of hearing, "Good night, Grandpa," before the lights went out. I had spent too much of my life looking backward, but now I only looked ahead. The wind whispered through the trees, and I closed my eyes, letting the moment sink in. I was home. I was loved, and for the first time in a long time, I was truly happy.